I'm going to use an example today which will seem inevitably like a very long, rambling anecdote, and in fairness, it will be a long, rambling anecdote. But it will take us to the meaning of today's reading, I promise. It will be long, but when it comes, bear with it for that reason. It will take us to the meaning of what we're looking at today in Matthew's Gospel, because you see, today's reading can be read in at least two different ways. It's either totally crushing, or it is remarkably reassuring. And unusually for sermons in this church and our normal approach, I'm not going to suggest that we usually read it in the wrong way, or we've been taught to read something in the wrong way, but there is another way to read it, which is the correct one, the correct meaning. Today, both meanings are correct. And what's critical is what we do with it. Today's reading is a very clever reading. If you go completely in one direction and take it to extremes, you lose sight of the spirit in which Matthew's Gospel wants us to take it. You have this incredibly difficult set of linked statements. Jesus takes some popular in the sense that anyone would think of them and come up with them examples of wrongdoing or questionable behaviour. You've heard that it was said, it is written. In other words, Jesus is saying, we all know this much you know. On this, I think we are all agreed. This is what you've heard that it was said, or you've heard that it was written means. Jesus is establishing common ground. Now, anyone who does that and says that is going to take his or her listeners forward. You've heard, but now hear this. You think this, now listen to this. But what Jesus does is to take massive examples on which everyone in his audience is going to agree. He goes right to the centre of the code, the 10 Commandments. Nobody can now disagree with him. He's beginning on absolutely solid ground. Politicians do this, economists do this. Everyone does this. You agree that you want to pay less taxes, that your children should be educated for nothing, that the elderly should be cared for properly, that you should have a pension. Jesus takes clear, undisputed, beyond debate givens in his world. Murder, adultery, he doesn't need to list anything else. His whole audience knows that he could go through the rest of the code, and they cannot and will not debate or argue. Nobody would. And I've heard people in the church tell me again and again that we should go back to the 10 Commandments, that we should live by the 10 Commandments. People will say, that's how I live. And I often wonder, I really wonder when I hear them talk like this, if they've ever read Matthew 5, or if they've ever read anything beyond the 10 Commandments, or sometimes even if they have actually read the 10 Commandments. I can only speak for myself, but I have in my pocket a number of pens, and I haven't purchased any of them. I haven't deliberately stolen any of them either, but at any given time, most of the pens in my pocket will be cheap biros which I have procured out of the box which my assistant has on his desk. They belong to him. He buys them in bulk. When I don't have a pen, I reach over and I grab one of his. And at the moment I also have one which I borrowed from an undertaker minutes before a funeral. I forgot to give it back, and I've been using it ever since. I had coffee with a prison officer the other day, and our conversation drifted off work and onto football. We were both being paid by the Scottish Prison Service to work, not to talk about football. Wee things, but all covered in and by the 10 Commandments. But they don't matter. Well, says Jesus, these little things may not matter, but we're talking about intention here. A big study into heroin use concluded that it's not cannabis and other soft drugs which lead to heroin use, it's tobacco. Once you decide not to take health advice seriously and to smoke for the first time, you've already begun to think in the way which goes against logic. The same thinking as will allow you to take a highly suspect and addictive substance despite advice, and contrary to where the evidence would lead you. And Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5 that if you wish to avoid falling over the cliff, you don't walk towards the edge of the precipice. You journey towards your fatal drop, or your journey towards your fatal drop begins a long way from the cliff top, whether or not you're aware of it. Jesus is saying more than that. And we'll come to that via my long rambling anecdote in the second part of this address. In June 1987, when I was sitting my final examinations in Hebrew, I'd worked pretty much non-stop for 3 years, and there were 5 days of examinations, and 3 years of work was going to be measured over these 5 days of examinations. Nothing unusual then, that's how it was in most universities. Things weren't spread out. So on the Thursday morning, the 4th day of these exams, I woke very early and felt extremely sick, nauseous. The exam that day was in the afternoon, 2 until 5. I knew it was nerves. I was living off not very much sleep and an awful lot of caffeine. I phoned the doctor, and he gave me an injection, but before it he gave me a warning. The injection would stop me being sick and it would calm me down, but it would also make my brain slow down. But, as he said, I wasn't going to go into any exam without something, so I might as well take the injection. He also said that he would give me a medical certificate. And so, injected with whatever it was, I then walked into the university. There was no way that I could sit the exam, I was convinced of that, but I was hit with a bombshell. Yes, the university would give me an exemption and take into account the situation, but it would be an ungraded ordinary degree and not an honours degree. I was convinced that if I sat the exam I would write nothing. I couldn't think of any Hebrew. In my panic, I looked at Hebrew texts, which I knew backwards and forwards and inside out, and my mind was blank. I went back to our flat. I had phone calls from members of staff. I could remember members of my family joining in. Everyone was saying the same thing: get into the exam and just write anything. We can do something with that. If it goes wrong, you have the medical certificate and we can bring that into play. But if you don't enter the exam hall, everything is lost. We can do nothing, and you will have nothing to show for these 3 years. So I sat the exam in the afternoon. I was very hazy. I felt groggy from the injection, but it actually went well. It was fine. But all I had to do was to face my fear of failure and go into the exam. That was all that I was asked to do. Now, what Matthew's Jesus is doing here is offering us something very similar. To those who think that we're doing okay, and that we're upright and honest and good and respectable people, and who might be inclined perhaps to judge and to look down on those who are not as good as we think we are, Jesus is saying, well, actually you've already committed murder and adultery, because as soon as you've stepped towards that, you're in the wrong. You've actually done all that you think you haven't done wrong, because as soon as you've stepped towards the act, you're in the wrong. It's a bit like with the woman caught in adultery and the men were about to stone her to death, and Jesus said, if you remember, he who hasn't sinned cast the first stone. But it's not quite like that. Here Jesus is simply saying that we're all guilty, it's just a matter of degree, but since God demands perfection, 49% is no better than 0. In fact, 99% is also no better than 0, because the standard is perfection, which is 100%. Anything else is a fail. And Jesus says, in what we've read, you've already failed. The time you steal from your employer, and the pen that you steal from your employer that doesn't really cost anything, isn't worth anything, the photocopying for which you don't pay, the CD you copied or downloaded illegally, is all stealing, for instance. So to the self-righteous and the deluded, Jesus is saying this: you've already failed. But to those who recognize that God demands perfection, Jesus offers it all the other way around. Nobody can pass this exam. Nobody is perfect. The person who has had even a vague thought of anger or lust is already guilty. And to the person who recognizes his or her own failure, this becomes not a warning but reassurance. It isn't okay, Jesus isn't saying that. It isn't good, he isn't saying that. It isn't acceptable, he isn't saying that. But what it is human. And in our reading today, we don't get to an answer. There isn't a neat conclusion. But a working hypothesis on the basis of this reading alone, and you would have to conclude this from this reading, is that Jesus is steering us away from any idea of a rule book or a pass and fail or getting to God through obedience to the letter of any law or a set of regulations. That what we are being is invited here to be compassionate towards both ourselves and to other people. Forgive and understand yourself, and forgive and understand each other. The rule book tells you that life is an exam you cannot pass, so do not expend your energy in trying to avoid failure. It's futile. And also, by the same token, life is something you cannot fail. If you are compassionate towards yourself and